6 years ago, you sent one message. You expected an answer. Instead, silence arrived. And somewhere inside you, a question remained alive long after you stopped admitting it mattered. Why did they never respond? Maybe you blamed yourself. Perhaps you assumed the connection meant more to you than it did to them. You may even have wondered whether they saw your words at all. But there is something you were never told. They saw them. They read your message. And they kept it. For 6 years. Not because they were playing games. Not because your words meant nothing. There was another reason. A reason so painful that answering you would have forced them to reveal something they were desperately trying to hide. Jesus says that some truths remain concealed until the heart is strong enough to receive them. Tonight, that hidden chapter begins to open. So before you decide this message is about someone else, remember the person who came into your mind the moment you heard the title. You did not choose that memory. It appeared on its own. Maybe you can still remember the conversation. The place. The season of your life. Perhaps you even remember the exact feeling you had when you realized there would be no reply. You checked your phone. Nothing. Later, you checked again. Still nothing. Eventually, you stopped. Life continued. Years passed. Yet something about that unfinished moment never completely disappeared. That is what makes this revelation unusual. The unanswered message did not disappear from their world either. They returned to it. Sometimes during quiet nights. Sometimes when loneliness became louder than pride. Once, they opened the conversation simply to look at your name. They stared at the words for several minutes. Then they closed everything. There was something they wanted to tell you. But fear won. And the strange part is that fear was not created by your message. It came from what happened immediately afterward. That detail changes everything. Because shortly after reading your words, your soulmate had a conversation with someone you probably never knew existed. That person gave them information about you. Information that sounded convincing. Information that frightened them. And instead of contacting you to verify it, they made a decision. They stayed silent. You were left wondering whether you had been rejected. They were left wondering whether answering you would cause something much worse. 6 years can make a person look completely different from the outside. Inside, however, regret can remain exactly where it began. There were moments when they almost reached out. A typed message. A deleted paragraph. A number opened on the screen. A name searched and then abandoned. Each attempt ended before it reached you. Why? That question is the doorway to the next revelation. Because the person who influenced their decision did not simply tell them to stay away. They claimed they were protecting them. And your soulmate believed it. At first. Then doubt appeared. Small at first. A strange inconsistency. A detail that did not make sense. Something they remembered differently. Then another clue surfaced. Years later, they realized that one part of the warning they had received could not possibly be true. That discovery changed the way they remembered everything. Suddenly, the silence felt different. It was no longer a decision made with confidence. It looked like a mistake. A terrible one. Archangel Michael stands at the edge of this revelation with a message of discernment. Not every voice that sounds protective comes from a place of truth. Sometimes fear disguises itself as wisdom. Sometimes another person's insecurity can redirect an entire life. And sometimes a person walks away from something precious because they were given the wrong information at the worst possible moment. Your soulmate eventually began questioning the story they had been told. That was when your old message became important again. They returned to it. This time, they noticed something they had missed years earlier. One sentence. Just one. It contained a clue. You had written something that unknowingly contradicted the warning they had received. They realized your words did not match the version of you they had been given. That realization disturbed them. Because if you were not the person they had been warned about, then why had they been told to disappear? Who benefited from their silence? And what really happened during those first few days after your message arrived? Those questions stayed with them. The years did not erase them. Instead, the mystery grew. There is another detail you need to hear. Your soulmate did not simply save the message in an old conversation. At one point, they made a copy. Why would someone do that? Because they were afraid the original might disappear. That means your words became something they considered important enough to preserve. Imagine carrying an unanswered message for 6 years while pretending it no longer matters. Imagine building a different life while knowing there is one conversation you never finished. Imagine seeing your name after years and feeling the same unresolved weight return. That was their private battle. But heaven was working in the background. Jesus says that what is hidden cannot remain hidden forever. A door has opened. A truth is moving toward the surface. And there is one part of this revelation that may completely change how you remember those 6 years. Your soulmate eventually discovered that the person who warned them about you had left out one critical fact. That missing detail explained everything. It explained the sudden distance. It explained the unanswered message. It explained why they never gave you a proper goodbye. Most importantly, it explained why they could not bring themselves to erase your words. They were carrying evidence of something they had not yet understood. And there is a reason I am not revealing that missing detail yet. Because if you hear it too early, you will miss what happened immediately before the truth came out. There was a particular night when your soulmate finally stopped running from the memory. They opened that old conversation. They read your message from beginning to end. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time in 6 years, they cried. Not because they had suddenly fallen in love. Because they realized what their silence had cost. The pain was not only about losing you. It was about knowing that you had spent years believing something that was never true. You thought they did not care. They knew they had never explained themselves. And now the distance between those two realities had become enormous. Archangel Michael's message is simple. Do not mistake delayed truth for forgotten truth. A closed chapter can still contain an unfinished sentence. A silent person can still carry a confession. And an old message can become the key that unlocks a truth years later. But there is one final piece. The sentence you wrote 6 years ago was not merely remembered. It became the thing that exposed the lie. Your soulmate eventually compared your words with what they had been told. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. That was the moment everything changed. They finally understood why they had been pushed away. They finally recognized who had influenced their decision. And they finally realized that the person they were trying to protect themselves from was never the real danger. The real danger had been much closer. And before this revelation reaches its deepest point, you need to know one thing. Your soulmate still has the message. 6 years later. The words are still there. And the reason they kept them is connected to something they planned to tell you when they finally found the courage. But they never expected the truth to return through the same message that started the silence. The next discovery is where this becomes impossible to ignore. Because someone else eventually saw those words. And that person recognized something your soulmate had completely missed. Something about you. Something about the connection. Something that could not be explained by coincidence. And when that realization finally reached your soulmate, they understood why heaven had allowed the message to remain unanswered for so long. The silence was never the ending. It was hiding the beginning of a truth they were not ready to hear. The person who eventually saw your message was not supposed to see it. That detail matters. Because your soulmate had kept the conversation private for years. It was buried among old memories, hidden beneath newer conversations, almost forgotten by everyone except the one person who could never truly forget it. Then, one ordinary evening, someone noticed the old message. They asked a simple question. Why do you still have that? Your soulmate had no answer. At least, not one they were willing to say aloud. They closed the screen. Changed the subject. Walked away. But the question followed them. Why had they preserved something connected to a person they supposedly wanted out of their life? That night, the old conversation was opened again. Your words appeared on the screen. 6 years had passed. Yet the emotional weight was still there. Something about your message felt different now. Back then, your soulmate had read it through fear. This time, they read it through regret. That difference revealed something enormous. The warning they had received had controlled their decision. But your own words had never supported that warning. There was kindness in what you wrote. There was honesty. There was vulnerability. Nothing matched the picture they had been given. For the first time, your soulmate wondered whether they had judged you without ever giving you a chance to speak. That realization hurt. But another discovery hurt even more. The person who warned them had known about your message. Not only that. They had known what you were going to say before your soulmate opened it. Think about that for a moment. How could someone know? Unless your soulmate had shown them something. Unless there had been a conversation before you ever realized what was happening. Unless someone had been quietly influencing the situation from the beginning. This was no longer about a missed reply. There was a hidden chain of events behind it. Your soulmate began remembering details they had dismissed years earlier. A strange phone call. A sudden change in someone's behavior. A warning that came at exactly the wrong time. A sentence that had sounded convincing back then. Everything began connecting. And one memory stood above the rest. They remembered being told that answering you would bring pain. So they listened. They chose silence. They believed disappearing would prevent damage. But 6 years later, they discovered something disturbing. The danger they had feared never came from you. It came from the person who had convinced them to walk away. That was when guilt entered the picture. Your soulmate began asking themselves a question they had avoided for years. What if I had answered? What if they had simply trusted their own instincts? What if they had ignored the warning? What if your message had been the beginning of something beautiful rather than something dangerous? There was no way to rewrite those years. That realization can break even a strong heart. And Jesus, in this spiritual reflection, reminds us that fear can make people mistake escape for protection. Your soulmate had escaped. But they had not found peace. That distinction became impossible to ignore. Their life had continued. Relationships may have come and gone. Responsibilities changed. People moved in and out. Yet whenever the past surfaced, one memory remained untouched. You. Not because they were constantly thinking about you. Something more complicated was happening. They had never received an ending. There was no final conversation. No explanation. No chance to look into your eyes and say what truly happened. Silence had created a blank space. And human hearts tend to fill blank spaces with their worst assumptions. You may have assumed they rejected you. They may have assumed you hated them. Neither of those conclusions had ever been confirmed. Both of you were living around an unanswered question. Then came the clue that shattered the old version of events. Your soulmate found something from 6 years ago. A message. A note. A record of that conversation. And suddenly, the timeline did not make sense. The warning they had received had happened before they could possibly have known certain details about your situation. Someone had information they should not have possessed. That discovery changed the entire atmosphere. Your soulmate became suspicious. They started looking deeper. Not obsessively. Not recklessly. Just enough to verify what they had once accepted without question. One detail led to another. A name appeared. Then another connection. Then a conversation they had completely forgotten. The truth was getting closer. And it was far more personal than they expected. The person who influenced their decision had not simply misunderstood you. They had their own reason for wanting distance between you. That reason had nothing to do with your character. It had nothing to do with your message. It was connected to what they believed would happen if you and your soulmate became closer. And that belief had been powerful enough to change 2 lives. If you feel something shifting while listening to this, right, the truth will surface. Not because a comment changes destiny. Because sometimes putting words to an emotion helps you recognize what you have been carrying. Now listen carefully. The most painful part for your soulmate was not discovering that someone had misled them. It was realizing that they had allowed fear to make the final decision. They had the ability to contact you. They had your message. They had questions. But they chose silence because silence felt safer. For a while, it worked. Until the memories returned. Years later, they understood something they could not understand at the beginning. Avoiding one difficult conversation had created 6 years of uncertainty. That is when they began thinking about reaching out. But another problem appeared. They no longer knew whether you would want to hear from them. You had changed. They had changed. Time had built a distance neither of you could simply pretend did not exist. Your soulmate feared that one message might reopen an old wound. So they hesitated again. This time, however, the hesitation came from guilt rather than fear. They wrote a message. It began with an apology. Then they stopped. Deleted it. Started again. The second attempt sounded too formal. Gone. A third version felt too emotional. Removed. Then they wrote the sentence they had been avoiding for years. I should have told you the truth. Their finger hovered over the screen. For a moment, it seemed like 6 years of silence might finally end. But before they could send it, something happened that changed the situation again. A new piece of information arrived. And this time, it came from someone connected to the past. That person revealed why the original warning had been given. Your soulmate finally heard the motive behind it. The reason was not what they expected. It was not hatred. It was not jealousy in the simple sense. It was something much deeper. Someone believed they were preventing a future that could never be undone. And they had been willing to manipulate the present to make sure that future never happened. Your soulmate finally understood the cost. They had not merely lost contact with you. They had been pushed away from a decision that should have belonged to them. That realization changed their feelings toward the old message. They stopped seeing it as a painful reminder. They started seeing it as evidence. Proof that your voice had always been different from the version of you they had been given. So they read your words one more time. 6 years after you sent them. And this time, one sentence struck them so deeply that they had to put the phone down. Because they finally understood what you had been trying to say. You had not been asking them to chase you. You had been giving them a chance to choose honestly. They had walked away without making that choice for themselves. And now they knew exactly what had taken that choice away. But there was still one secret missing. The identity of the person who had started the entire chain of events was only part of the truth. The deeper revelation concerned something your soulmate had been told about your future together. Something so specific that they believed staying away was an act of protection. Years later, that prediction began falling apart. One event happened. Then another. And eventually, reality contradicted the warning completely. That was the moment your soulmate realized the past had been built around a lie. Yet the most shocking discovery was still ahead. Because when they compared that old warning with the message you sent 6 years earlier, they noticed something impossible. Your final sentence contained a clue about what would happen later. You had written it casually. You had no idea how important it would become. Your soulmate does now. And that is why the message was never deleted. They were no longer keeping it because they missed you. They were keeping it because it held the last piece of a truth they had spent 6 years trying to understand. And once they discovered what your final sentence actually meant, their entire memory of that night changed. But there was still one person they needed to confront. And that confrontation would finally reveal why you were never given the explanation you deserved. The confrontation did not happen the way your soulmate imagined. There was no dramatic scene. No shouting. No accusation thrown across a room. Instead, there was one quiet question. Why did you tell me to stay away from them? The person on the other side of the conversation went silent. That silence said more than an explanation could have. For years, your soulmate had carried someone else's version of what happened. Now they wanted the truth. At first, the answer was vague. Old excuses appeared. Concern. Protection. Fear of consequences. But none of it explained the details. Your soulmate kept asking. One question after another. Eventually, the real reason began to surface. The warning had never been based on something you had actually done. It was based on something that person believed would happen if the two of you became close. That belief had been planted long before your final message arrived. And there was something even more disturbing. Your soulmate discovered that the person who interfered had misunderstood one crucial event involving you. A situation had been seen from the outside. A conclusion had been drawn. Then that conclusion was repeated so many times that it eventually sounded like fact. Your soulmate had accepted it without checking. That was the mistake. Not yours. Theirs. For the first time, they understood why your behavior had never matched the description they had received. The pieces finally aligned. Your silence after their disappearance. Their distance after receiving your message. The strange warning. The sudden change. Everything had been connected. But there was still one question that refused to disappear. Why did they never come back after discovering the truth? That answer was harder. Because by the time your soulmate realized what had happened, they were ashamed. They knew contacting you would mean admitting something painful. I was wrong. Those 3 words can be harder to say than an apology. Especially when 6 years have passed. Your soulmate wondered whether you would even believe them. Maybe you had rebuilt your life. Maybe someone else had become important to you. Maybe the old message meant nothing anymore. Maybe you had deleted their memory completely. That uncertainty became another wall. But something unexpected happened. A date appeared on the calendar. The same date connected to the message you sent 6 years earlier. Your soulmate noticed it by accident. And suddenly, the old conversation returned to their mind with extraordinary clarity. They opened it again. Your message was still there. The words looked different now. Not because the message had changed. Because your soulmate had. Back then, they had seen pressure. Now they saw vulnerability. Back then, they had interpreted your words through fear. This time, they understood what you had actually been offering. A choice. An honest conversation. Nothing more complicated than that. And then they reached the final sentence. The sentence that had haunted them for years. They read it slowly. Twice. Then a memory returned. You had mentioned something that was happening in your life at the time. It seemed insignificant. But later, that detail became connected to the event that had exposed the original lie. Suddenly, your soulmate realized something. You had unknowingly warned them. Not about danger. About the truth. Your words had contained information that contradicted everything they had been told. They simply had not recognized it. That was the moment regret became overwhelming. Imagine realizing that the person you abandoned had unknowingly left you the clue that could have prevented the entire separation. Imagine discovering that the answer was sitting inside your phone for 6 years. That is what happened. And this is where Archangel Michael's message becomes important. Discernment matters. Not every closed door means rejection. Not every delay means denial. Sometimes a person walks away because they cannot distinguish fear from intuition. Sometimes another voice becomes louder than their own heart. But there is something else you need to understand. This revelation is not telling you to wait for someone indefinitely. It is not asking you to put your life on hold. Your purpose does not depend on another person's courage. If this connection is meant to return, it will not require you to destroy your peace to make it happen. Jesus reminds us that truth does not need manipulation. What belongs in your life will not need deception to survive. That realization changed your soulmate. They stopped asking, "How can I get them back?" A deeper question took its place. How can I tell them what really happened? That was the beginning of genuine accountability. Not fantasy. Not nostalgia. Not an emotional impulse. Responsibility. Your soulmate wanted you to know that the silence had never been the simple rejection you believed it was. There had been another story underneath it. And they finally had enough courage to face that story. But there was one final obstacle. They did not know where you were. 6 years can move people far away. New routines. New places. Different circles. Changed circumstances. The person they once knew might no longer be reachable through the same path. So they began searching. Not desperately. Carefully. One old contact led to another. A forgotten connection became useful. Someone remembered a detail. Another person recognized your name. Slowly, a trail appeared. Then came something unexpected. They discovered that you had also kept something from those years. Not the message. Something else. A small reminder connected to the same period of your life. That discovery shook them. Because it meant the past had not been completely erased on your side either. You had moved forward. But perhaps you had never received enough information to understand why everything ended. Your soulmate realized that you had been carrying your own unanswered question. For 6 years, two people had been living with different versions of the same silence. Neither had the complete picture. Neither had known the real reason. And now, for the first time, the missing pieces were coming together. Then came the message they had been afraid to send. Not a casual greeting. Not, "How have you been?" Not a simple attempt to reopen the conversation. They wrote the truth. They explained why they disappeared. They admitted that your message had been read. They confessed that it had been kept. They told you that someone else had influenced their decision. Most importantly, they admitted that they had been afraid. The message remained unsent for several minutes. Their hand hovered over the screen. 6 years were sitting behind one button. Then they remembered something. Your final sentence. The sentence that had survived all that time. It reminded them why they had never deleted the conversation. They pressed send. And now comes the part that changes the entire meaning of this revelation. Your soulmate did not receive an immediate response. Minutes passed. Nothing. An hour. Still silence. For the first time, they experienced the exact feeling you had known 6 years earlier. The waiting. The uncertainty. The temptation to assume the worst. And suddenly, they understood you. Not intellectually. Emotionally. They finally knew what their silence had felt like from your side. That realization broke something open inside them. They stopped expecting forgiveness. They stopped demanding an answer. They simply wanted the truth to reach you. But heaven was not finished. Because while your soulmate believed the hardest part was over, another piece of information surfaced. Someone from the past came forward with something that had been hidden for 6 years. A record of the original conversation. Proof of what had actually been said. And the evidence revealed something far more serious than a misunderstanding. The warning had been based on a secret. A secret your soulmate had never known. A secret involving the person who interfered. And once that final piece was uncovered, your soulmate realized why that person had been so determined to keep you apart. It was not because you were dangerous. It was not because your connection was unhealthy. It was because your presence threatened something they had spent years protecting. Their control. Their influence. Their carefully constructed version of reality. Your soulmate finally saw it. The separation had served someone. And it was not either of you. That realization changed everything. The old message was no longer simply a memory. It had become the first piece of evidence. The beginning of a truth that had taken 6 years to surface. But there is still one question. What exactly was being protected? Why would someone go so far to prevent two people from speaking? And what did that hidden secret have to do with the final sentence you wrote 6 years ago? That is where the deepest revelation begins. Because the answer is not simply about another person. It is about something your soulmate discovered concerning you. Something they had been told was impossible. Something that, once confirmed, made them realize the connection had been misunderstood from the very beginning. And when they finally learned the truth, they understood why they could never bring themselves to delete your message. They had been waiting for the day when they could finally prove that your words had never been the problem. Their fear had been. Their silence had been. And the lie they believed had been. Now only one thing remained. The truth had to reach you. And when it did, you would finally understand why 6 years of silence had never been as empty as they appeared. The truth was finally placed in front of them. There was nowhere left to hide. The person who had influenced your soulmate 6 years earlier finally admitted what had really happened. They had been afraid of losing control. Your connection had made them uncomfortable. Not because you had done something wrong. Because they could see that your soulmate trusted you in a way they could not control. So they created doubt. A warning was planted. A story was carefully shaped. Certain details were exaggerated. Others were completely omitted. Your soulmate believed the version that reached them first. That was the tragedy. You never got the opportunity to tell your side. And they never gave themselves permission to ask. One conversation could have changed everything. Instead, 6 years disappeared. Your soulmate finally understood that the person they trusted had been protecting their own interests. The realization was devastating. But there was something even harder to accept. The old message had contained exactly what they needed to know. You had written from a place of honesty. You were not demanding anything. You were not trying to force a future. You simply wanted an honest answer. Your soulmate had interpreted that vulnerability through the fear someone else had placed inside their mind. Now they could finally see the difference. You had offered a door. Fear convinced them it was a trap. So they walked away. And the door remained there. 6 years later, they finally understood. Jesus reminds us that truth does not become less true because people take years to recognize it. A hidden answer can remain hidden. But it does not cease to exist. That is why your soulmate kept your message. It was not merely sentimental. It became a reminder of the moment they made a decision without knowing the whole truth. Every time they considered deleting it, something stopped them. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps a quiet feeling that the story was unfinished. Now they understood. They had been keeping the last piece of the real story. And there was another reason they could never erase it. Your final sentence had become a promise. You had written something like, "If you ever want the truth, you know where to find me." At the time, you probably meant it simply. You were leaving the door open for an honest conversation. You had no idea those words would survive 6 years. You had no idea they would eventually become the reason your soulmate found courage. That sentence became their turning point. Because they realized you had never demanded that they chase you. You had simply asked them to be honest. That difference hit them deeply. So they sent the message. They explained everything. The warning. The fear. The person who interfered. The reason they disappeared. And finally, the sentence they had avoided for 6 years. "I was wrong to leave without telling you why." Then they waited. This time, they understood what waiting meant. They did not know whether you would answer. They did not know whether forgiveness was possible. They did not know whether your life had moved in another direction. For once, they could not control the outcome. All they could do was tell the truth. And that is where this spiritual message becomes bigger than romance. Sometimes closure does not arrive when you expect it. Sometimes God allows time to expose what emotion could not reveal. People change. Motives become visible. False stories collapse. And what once looked like rejection can eventually be understood as a painful chapter filled with information you did not possess at the time. Archangel Michael represents courage, protection, and discernment in this message. The lesson is not to chase an old connection. It is to recognize truth when it finally appears. If someone returns, let their actions speak. If an apology comes, listen without abandoning your boundaries. If an explanation arrives, you do not have to erase the years that passed. You are allowed to acknowledge what happened. You are allowed to forgive without reopening every door. And you are allowed to continue walking forward. Your worth was never determined by that unanswered message. That is important. Because for years, you may have quietly wondered whether their silence meant you were not enough. It did not. Their silence reflected what they were struggling with. Their fear. Their confusion. Their inability to confront the situation. None of those things measured your value. The revelation becomes even more powerful here. Your soulmate eventually realized that the person they had been trying to avoid disappointing was never the person they should have feared. The real loss had already happened. They had allowed someone else's voice to become louder than their own discernment. And 6 years later, they were finally taking responsibility. That is why their apology mattered. Not because an apology magically restores time. It cannot. 6 years are still 6 years. The missed conversations remain missed. The memories cannot be rewritten. But truth can change the meaning you assign to the past. And perhaps that is what this message is really bringing to you. Maybe you have carried an old unanswered question for too long. Maybe you blamed yourself for someone's disappearance. Maybe you believed their silence was a final judgment on your worth. It was not. You were simply missing information. And sometimes the absence of information can make the heart create painful explanations. Tonight, let one thought settle inside you. You do not need to punish yourself for a decision another person made without knowing the whole truth. You did what you knew to do. They did what they believed they had to do. Now the truth has its own timing. And here comes the final revelation. Your soulmate did not keep your message for 6 years because they were waiting for the perfect moment to return. They kept it because somewhere inside, they knew the story had been interrupted. They knew there was no real ending. That message represented the last moment when your connection had been honest and untouched by someone else's interference. It was the final piece of reality they could still access. When everything around the memory became confusing, your words remained unchanged. That is why they protected them. And eventually, those same words exposed the lie. The thing they thought had caused the separation became the thing that revealed why the separation happened. Your message was never the wound. It was the evidence. The silence was never proof that you meant nothing. It was proof that someone was too afraid to confront what they believed. And the 6-year delay was not a measurement of your value. It was a measurement of how long it took your soulmate to face the truth. Now, there is something you need to hear before this message ends. Do not spend tonight staring at your phone. Do not search through old conversations looking for signs. Do not put your life on hold waiting for a notification. If this person is meant to return, truth will require action from them. Not imagination from you. Not endless waiting. Not chasing. Action. Let them explain. Let them take responsibility. Let them show consistency. And if they never appear, you still walk forward knowing that their silence was never the verdict you once believed it was. Jesus does not ask you to remain trapped inside an unanswered question. He calls you toward peace. And Archangel Michael's message is one of protection. Protect your heart from obsession. Protect your peace from uncertainty. Protect your future from becoming hostage to someone else's hesitation. The revelation can bring understanding without becoming an instruction to wait. That distinction matters. Because perhaps the greatest miracle is not that your soulmate finally remembers you. Perhaps it is that you finally stop measuring your worth by whether they do. You survived the silence. You grew through the unanswered years. You became someone they could no longer understand from the old version of their memory. And if they return, they will have to meet the person you became. Not the person they left behind. That is the part they may not expect. 6 years changed you too. You may have become stronger. More selective. More peaceful. Less willing to accept confusion. That is why the future cannot simply repeat the past. If another conversation happens, it must begin with honesty. No hidden motives. No outside voices controlling the outcome. No disappearing when emotions become difficult. Just truth. And perhaps that is why the message survived. Because one day, someone needed to finally understand what it meant. You wrote those words 6 years ago without knowing how powerful they would become. Your soulmate carried them through every season that followed. They could have deleted them. They didn't. They could have convinced themselves the connection meant nothing. They couldn't. They could have forgotten the moment. They tried. But whenever life became quiet enough, the memory returned. Not to torture them. To remind them of the truth they had avoided. Now the silence has a different meaning. It was never empty. It was filled with fear, confusion, regret, and a truth waiting for the right moment. And if you are hearing this at a moment when one particular person keeps crossing your mind, take the message for what it is meant to give you. Not a command. Not a guarantee. A reminder. You are not defined by who answered. You are not diminished by who walked away. You are not forgotten because someone lacked the courage to speak. Your story is larger than one unanswered message. And your future is larger than 6 years of silence. If this touched something inside you, write one sentence in the comments: I choose truth over fear. Let that be your reminder. Not that someone must return. Not that you must wait. But that from this moment forward, you will no longer create your identity from another person's silence. And if the person from 6 years ago really does return, let them come with the truth they should have brought the first time. Let them explain. Let them apologize. Let them show you through actions why they are standing in front of you again. Because the biggest revelation was never simply that your soulmate kept your last message. It was why they could not erase it. Your words represented the one version of the past that had never been corrupted by fear. They were the last honest thing between you. 6 years later, that honesty became impossible to ignore. And now the unanswered question has an answer. They did not stay silent because you were unworthy of a response. They stayed silent because they were afraid of a truth they had been taught to misunderstand. Someone else's warning became louder than their own heart. Their fear became stronger than their courage. And by the time they discovered the truth, years had already passed. That is the part they regret most. Not losing control. Not being alone. Losing the opportunity to tell you the truth when it could have changed everything. So if this message found you tonight, breathe. You do not have to solve the past before you can live the future. You do not need another person's confession to know your value. And you certainly do not have to chase an old door. If it is meant to open again, let it open from the other side. This time, let truth walk through first. And let fear remain outside. Because 6 years ago, you sent a message. You thought you were sending words into silence. You were not. Someone read them. Someone saved them. Someone carried them. And after 6 years, those same words became the evidence that finally exposed the truth. The message was never forgotten. The person was never completely certain. And the silence was never the whole story. Sometimes heaven allows the answer to arrive late because the people involved were not ready to understand it when it first appeared. But when truth finally comes, it does not need to scream. It simply becomes impossible to deny. And now you know what that silence was hiding.